Hello everyone. Today's lecture is on early hominins. I'm just cleaning my board from the last time I used it. So you'll see that these last few, for this final section, there are quite a few lectures, but they're all, well, a few of them are kind of shorter. Like there was the one we did before this one. This one's a bit short. The next one's not too long, right? So even though you're like, oh, there's like, 5 videos for this section, they're not as long as some of the other ones, so that's good. Okay, good. Let that dry. I don't even know if I'm going to need this, but I'd rather be prepared. Okay. So, let's see. So if you're following along with the PowerPoints, we're on the one that says early hominins. And here we go. So the first slide, you'll see hominin phylogeny. And as the bullet point shows, this can be very complicated, like in class, maybe I drew this one time, but on some of the previous PowerPoints or lectures you have probably seen, and well, on the PowerPoints as well, so you can even see one image on this first slide, that sometimes I'll reference, like, oh, talking about the relatedness of humans and chimps, we'll say, we've got chimps, humans, right? And then we'll say, oh, and our last common ancestor about 6 million years ago. And so it's this nice little, straight line on either side. And to get the point across of the relatedness, this is fine, right? As you can see the image, on the slide as well. But see that red arrow? When we're talking about hominins, we are talking about everything in that lineage. So everything since our split with chimps to modern humans. But as you'll see with the other image on the slide, it is not a nice straight line, right? It's very complicated. We've got some branching events, some stuff died out, we got more branching events, right? It's a lot more complicated than just a single line, right? Sometimes in our ancestry, we have one species that slowly evolves into something else. Recall we talked about the difference between anagenesis and cladogenesis. And then sometimes we have one species where there's a branching event and we see a split, cladogenesis, right? So we see, this is true for like all forms of life, plants, animals, we see both of these. If you look, further back into the lineage, you're going to see both of these things. So in ours, it's not this nice little straight line. It's pretty complicated, right? And as we go through some of the species, I'll be able to explain like the different branching events and, etc. So, but just keep in mind, we have a pretty good idea, like as paleoanthropologists, a pretty good idea of like how the story went, which ones were where and, what evolved from what, where they were living in the world, but we don't have every single, fossil ever, right? And so while we could say we're pretty confident in what happened, there's always the chance, as we talked about in science, changing with new evidence, that a new fossil comes along and maybe doesn't change anything that we knew, but adds another little branch. So we're constantly kind of refining this and gaining more knowledge about our lineage. Okay, so moving on to the next slide, you will see what I was, a little image of kind of what I just drew, and showing you how we're going to walk through like these different species as we go along the human lineage. So you'll see we're going to be talking about the early genera right now for this PowerPoint. Genera is plural for genus, so it's not genuses, it's genera. And like I remember taking this course years ago and not really having a good visual representation, so this is why I have this on the slide. You'll see a really good visual representation of the time as we're kind of going through time. And so you'll see basically right after the split, those are like the first in our lineage, the first hominins. So those are the ones I'm going to very briefly just kind of mention right now. We're going to go into a lot more detail into like the middle part of our lineage and then like the later part of our lineage. So you'll see here on that bullet point, or on the slide, the bullet points, there are 3 genera listed. And in class, if you can't remember how to pronounce these, or you get it close enough, then like that's fine, right? So Sahelanthropus, Aurorin, and Ardipithecus. So those are the 3. And like I said, those are all different genera. But it's also important to remember that with this earlier stuff, we still like we're still finding a lot of fossils, right? Like we can be really confident in the middle part of our lineage or even the later part because we just have like plethora of specimens, right? But in the early part of our lineage, not as much. And so while we can still say, oh, we have found these fossils, it's indicating, bipedalism or etc. Like not having as many as specimens as we have for the later stuff, allows us to kind of be a little more open with some of these discoveries in the early part of the lineage. So just kind of keep that in mind. And one of those things even being like we might say now, oh, these are 3 different genera, but as we get more, fossils, as we're kind of refining these groups, and remember the idea of a species or a genus, those are all human-made categories, right? Like we are the ones who came up with these categories, the hierarchy of the categories, the criteria for being in any of those categories, like even dependent on what, if you're looking at animals or plants, right? So we are the ones creating the system. Nature's just doing whatever it's doing. We're trying to put, categories and boxes around everything to help us with our scientific research, we have a pretty decent system. But remember, nature is just doing whatever it's doing. And when we find a handful of fossils and we want to put names on them right away, just know, as we do in science all the time, more fossils come about, maybe some renaming, recategorizing. I would not be surprised, especially for the early stuff in the hominin lineage, if that like ends up happening in the coming years, right? So if you go to the next slide, you will see the first one, Sahelanthropus chadensis. I got one of those like the 1 liters at the Dollar Tree. Oh, it's not, I'm not drinking out of a giant 2 liter, but it is pretty big. Okay. So Sahelanthropus chadensis, you will see here what we call the type specimen. So a type specimen is essentially like the first specimen that's discovered, that we say, oh, this is something completely new. And so it's like the first of that, species that's discovered. And any subsequent fossils or specimens that are discovered after that will be compared to that first one, to that type specimen. So we see here with Sahelanthropus, like very fragmented, right? But you can still see the face, the head, no mandible, right? There's no mandible here. But you can still see like the maxilla really well. The teeth, most of them are still there. And there's like one question on this PowerPoint slide, right? It says, what do you notice about this skull? So what I'm hoping you'll notice, especially when thinking of comparing it to the other skeletal materials we've talked about in class with like the primates or the human stuff, right? That you notice some things about this particular specimen. One, the brain is pretty small, right? So from what you can kind of see this, one image, you can kind of see the area where the brain would have been, and it's, smaller. Now remember, there's no goal in anywhere in nature, animals to have a big brain. We see it happening, and so we can look back and like those lineages and say, oh, that's how and why it happened, right? But there's no goal towards having a big brain. So at the beginning of our lineage, even when we say, big brains or, high EQ is something that's characteristic of our lineage, remembering that concept of they're not going to happen at the same time and they're not going to happen at the same rate. So big brains, while we can say, oh, all hominins, our group has bigger brains, that's true, but we don't see big brains kind of happening until actually like much later in our lineage. They slowly get a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger, and then we see a big jump later, which when we get to that, we'll talk about it. But you can see, especially if we're talking about, let's say, the very first in our lineage, you can imagine maybe some of the features of like we characterized hominins as, like those features will be there, but some of them might not be just yet, especially if it's like right at the beginning of our lineage. So you might say, well, the brain is maybe, you don't have the numbers yet, but let's even just visually, you could say, well, it looks kind of, it doesn't look tiny, but it's definitely not what we would expect to see, like something compared to us as a human. But just like I said, remember, there's no goal in evolution for any trait, right? And so it's interesting when we look at our lineage and say, oh, here's where brains were getting a little bigger, here's where there was a big jump, right? And so it's not a surprise that obviously they're going to be smaller, earlier on. You'll also notice, hopefully, one thing that really pops out to you is the giant brow ridge. The giant brow ridge, right? It's like a shelf. It's so massive, right? It's the most prominent feature of the specimen, and it's bigger than what we've seen with any of the primate stuff, right? Or at least comparable to some of the bigger ones. The eyes are pretty big. And the teeth, even though the teeth, they're not massive. right? But they're not small either. So we see teeth in our lineage, at the beginning, no surprise. They're still a little bit, medium size, but they get small pretty quickly along the faster than probably the big brains. We get smaller teeth before we get really big brains. So our teeth, especially recall we talked about sexual selection in primates, not always, but oftentimes the canines, for males and females, if that's one of those features, they will have, the males will have larger canines for sexual selection and all that, right? But of course, not every species of primate who is dimorphic will have the canines as one of those features. Like we talked about some of the New World monkeys where coloring is like the most prominent, right? But so in our lineage, and we're thinking, what were some of the features of dimorphism? Because clearly, modern Homo sapiens are sexually dimorphic. We have a moderate amount of dimorphism, kind of like similar to like a chimpanzee. But looking in earlier in our lineage, like, was it still moderate amount? Was it more? What were the features? Were there color differences? Was it size and shape? We kind of see that throughout. But canines don't seem to be a dimorphic feature for us, for our, like, as a group, as our lineage. So interesting. In the next slide, you will see a little bit more info on Sahelanthropus tchadensis. I have the dates and locations on the PowerPoints just for your, like, if you were curious. I am never going to ask you those. I remember when I had to learn, like, this for when I took this class years ago, and we only had to learn, like, we had to memorize them for the exam, right? Locations, dates, and then we all forgot them. You know what I mean? I have them there because it is important information, and if you were going to continue in anthropology, you would, especially like in paleo, you would want to know, at least in a general sense, oh, this is, around 5 million years ago, or 2 million, or, so I have the information there, but it's not something I'm going to ask you on the exam. As long as you have a general idea of, like, what came before or after, then that's fine for now. So you'll see some of those bullet points at, like, for example, the huge brow ridge, which we just talked about. Thin enamel on the teeth, if you recall, those 6 traits that all hominins share. Thick enamel is one of them, but remember, they're not all going to happen right at the beginning. So thin enamel for, like, maybe the first in our lineage kind of would make sense that it would get thick maybe, like, after that. And you see the position of the foramen magnum, bipedal question marks. The only reason there's a question mark, when you only have a handful of specimens, 1, 2, 5, 10, versus, like, what we have later where we have like 50, 100, 500, and especially if those specimens are a little fragmented, we can say as a scientist that it appears that foramen magnum placement is indicative of bipedalism, but obviously wanting to get more info to have a, confirm that's important too. So, we could say, oh, they're most likely bipedal, but having a question mark of, well, let's get some more info. Let's get some more info and confirm there's nothing wrong with that. And so also look at the actual image there that I have with, like, the humans versus chimps and the lineages. You'll see at the bottom 2 red lines for Sahelanthropus tchadensis. And this is indicating that some paleoanthropologists think Sahelanthropus tchadensis was the first in our lineage. Like, we go, we have a split, and Sahelanthropus is the very first hominin. Others have suggested that Sahelanthropus tchadensis is the actual common ancestor, that it's not the first in our lineage, but it's actually the ancestor we have with chimpanzees. And in that case, the bipedalism question mark will kind of make sense because, so I'll let you know. So as far as the fossil evidence we have, like, I'll use this again. So like I said, we have a lot of really good fossil evidence for the later part of our lineage. Let me see, there we go. The later part of our lineage, a lot. Even this middle part, quite a bit, It's really this earlier part here that's a little bit, we have less. And in the chimpanzee lineage as well, some decent amount of stuff a little bit here, but there's a big amount of stuff in the chimp lineage that there's, let's say, a little more limited fossil information on. And so when we're looking at the actual split of who was that ancestor and what do we see kind of at the beginning of the chimp or the beginning of the human, there's still a lot of questions, right? We have some stuff, that's great. And based on what we see happens later, we can, have some good ideas of what we're going to find and stuff. But there are still questions about this. So with Sahelanthropus, it's like, oh, is it the first in our lineage, or is it the last common ancestor? Is the question. So moving on to the next slide, you'll see the next one, Auroran tugenensis, and here you will see images of some of the first specimens that were discovered. So you can see there's clearly femora. Remember, the plural for femur is femora, it's not femurs. There's also clearly part of a mandible. It looks like probably part of a tibia, and then some other fragments, right? So remember, you can tell if an individual is bipedal based on multiple parts of their body. It could be the legs, the pelvis. It could also be, the skull, the feet, right? So there's a lot of areas where you can look at to be able to determine if an individual is bipedal. Now, obviously, the more areas you have to confirm is always good, but you could have just like a fragment of the femur and you'd probably be able to tell if someone was, bipedal. You could have a fragment of just the occipital bone. It was the right fragment and you could probably tell. So moving on to the next slide, you'll see a little bit more info on Auroran, and you'll see once again that image, showing the chimp and human, lineage. So basically on all of the slides, I have something similar to this with a little bit of info, to give you a good visual of where we're talking about. And then we see there's still a decent sized canine for Auroran, but remember the canine gets pretty small pretty quickly. But obviously, if we're talking about the very beginning of our lineage, it makes sense that the canine's still large-ish, medium, and then it gets pretty small after that. Evidence of bipedalism, no doubt for this one. And then now we have thick enamel. So remember, that was one of those 6 traits we talked about for hominins. Let's see if we can remember them off the top of my head. Big brains, or higher EQ. Bipedalism, probably the most important one. No CP3 hone, thick enamel, reduced prognathism, parabolic dental arch, right? So those are the 6. So thick enamel is one of them. We didn't see that with Sahelanthropus, which even if that is the first in our lineage, that's fine because all of these traits don't all happen at the very same time, right? So we see thick enamel happening with maybe the next one in our lineage or something like that. Could be, that kind of makes sense, right? And if you look you'll see on that image, we have Auroran with a red line kind of right at the beginning. Remember, we say approximately 6 million years for the split, but it's typically like 5 to 7. And so I don't know if we have refined that more than that. So sometimes if you find something right at 6 or a little more than 6 or a little less than 6, trying to figure out, is that something in the human lineage? Is it 4? Is it in the chimp? You're going to want to look for bipedalism. That's going to mostly tell you it's more so likely than not in our lineage, although sometimes things get weird, right? So I think I have that on the next slide, or coming up. So the next slide, though, is Ardipithecus ramidus, so the 3rd of these early genera. And you'll see here this image is like a computerized, generated, of this skull. And you can see where it's fragmented and stuff, but you can still see where a lot of the features are fairly prominent. So once again, the brow ridge, although it's kind of fragmented, is a bit prominent. Not as much as Sahelanthropus for sure. The teeth, and remember the gums and stuff aren't there, so the teeth always look a little longer and bigger because when you don't have the gums there. But there's still the canine is definitely a little larger than the incisors, but it's not. You can see where it's basically, we call it the occlusal line, where it's hanging down from the incisors. It's draw. So if it was oh, here's an incisor, here's another incisor, and then here's the canine. If the canine was hanging down really far, we'd be like, whoa, massive canine, right? Primate, probably sexual selection, something like that. But what we're seeing, I just drive so fast. What we're seeing, even with some of the early stuff, is maybe a canine like that. It's still there, and it's still kind of prominent, but it gets small really quickly. In fact, it gets small pretty quickly to the fact where we're like, oh yeah, there's a canine, because it's a tiny bit pointier, but it basically has the same function as an incisor, right? So in the human lineage, our canine really becomes a 3rd incisor, essentially. It kind of has the same function. Next slide, you'll see a really great, one of the fossil finds, right? So now we have, still fragmented, but pretty decently complete. You can see the brain, a bit small, right? no problem there. Brow ridge, actually, a big chunk of that's kind of gone. That's fine. But we can still see the eyes, like all the bones around the orbit. You can see a big portion of the maxilla. So this bone in the front of your face, right? Either side of your nose and like here. You can see there's a little bit of prognathism. Recall one of those features for hominins is reduced prognathism, or like less projection of the face, right? Now, primates compared to non-primates, we have flatter faces, and then our lineage, within all of primates, our lineage even has flatter faces, right? Like humans have a very flat face. We don't have anything like real projection of our snout or anything coming out, right? And you can see here with Ardipithecus, there's a tiny bit around the mouth, but it's like still fairly like minimal, and we really see our lineage they just get pretty flat. A decent portion of the mandible, and you can see a lot of the teeth. So you can see that mandible is pretty big, right? We're still having a pretty decent sized mouth. The teeth all over are still kind of a moderate, decent size. You know, we're gonna see that feature over time in our lineage, like faces, mouths get a lot smaller, right? But you can still see here they're pretty prominent. And you'll see, like I mentioned before, a lot of those bullet points showing like the dates, locations, and you can see how many specimens were discovered. So as we kind of move along in the lineage, we're going to basically, if we find more stuff, it's just less time has passed, and so we have more that's preserved, essentially. And if we go to the next slide, you will see kind of what I was talking about a second ago. So with looking at these early finds, whether we think it's in our lineage, the chimp lineage, another lineage, right? There can be a lot of questions. And so when you look at this image, you'll see that there's a third branch. Now, when we talk about cladogenesis, usually we reference it being like, a split into two, but it can be a split into more. Sometimes that third branch, evolves into something else. Sometimes it dies off. And so this has been a hypothesis for what we see going on with Ardipithecus ramidus. And so you see here we have the chimp lineage, the human lineage, and then that third lineage, Ardipithecus ramidus. Some have hypothesized that maybe Ardipithecus is not in the human lineage, but it was like a third branching event, and this might explain some of the features, which you can see in the bullet point. So the canine size is still a bit, moderate. Bipedalism, features indicate bipedal, which you would think, oh, that's in the human lineage. But then we have thin enamel again. That's really, really strange. So teeth are what we call evolutionarily conservative. And so changes to teeth, don't just happen whatever. And they typically don't happen fast. Exceptions to that sometimes. But suddenly we have, in Sahelanthropus, thin enamel, and then Auroran thick enamel, and then Ardipithecus thin enamel again. That doesn't really make sense, right? And so, like I said, some have hypothesized that it makes sense if actually Ardipithecus was just a third branch, and they were kind of doing their own thing, and it just, didn't really evolve into anything. And so in that case, there would have been kind of two lineages that went bipedal. One continued us and one kind of died out. Some paleoanthropologists would say, no, Ardipithecus is in our lineage. There's just some weird stuff going on with the teeth. So like I said, with that early stuff, keep in mind that there's still a lot of interesting questions. We're hopeful to find more stuff to be able to solidify like what we know about those early species, early genera in our lineage. Okay, so that's it for that one, and I will see you guys on the next one.